we're going to get started by taking one step back, and then we're going to jump back into this. You might have noticed I was not here last week. I was out in Tampa taking some classes, and so I want to take a stab at some general themes in Judges briefly, and then we're going to kind of dive into our text. So some of this is going to be a little bit of a recap from what Father Chris presented last week, but then we're going to dive in. So the book of Judges, and here's your pop quiz, and I won't call on you by name, but do you remember some of the things that Father Chris said just generally about the book of Judges last week? What some of the themes are? Okay, so most of these are leaders, but they're not judicial judges. Yep, that's right. Is this a positive period in Israel's history? Is this a golden age of flourishing for the Israelites? No, it's not, right? Which again, there's a lot of subtle lamentation in this book about the state of Israel, because if you remember, we're coming right off the book of Joshua, where Joshua came in and started the conquering of Canaan and went pretty far in, and as we heard last week, they fell short. They failed. They didn't drive out the Canaanites, and so they were kind of just stuck in this mess. And what you see throughout the book of Judges, as we heard last week, is this decay. There's a falling apart that we see in a lot of different ways. It's not just explicitly written, but in the structure of the book, there's falling away. Structure, content, the way that even the particular story elements of each of the epochs in each of the pericopes, there's a degradation there, which is fascinating. I mean, well, we're going to talk about it in a second. So just a basic outline of the book of Judges. As we saw kind of last week, you have in chapters 1 through 3, there's the introduction, there's the setup for the book of what are the failures of the Israelites. So chapters 1 through 3 are the failures that kind of set the tone for the rest of it. Now we are in which we began last week and we're continuing this week, we're in the cycles of what they call apostasy and deliverance. So they fall away, they cry out to the Lord, as we're going to see that in a second, and they're delivered. And this goes until from about chapter 3 to about chapter 16, so that's the bulk of it. And then we get into what they call the depths of the Canaanization of Israel, so when it's just fully gone over into the other culture. And we talked about that a little bit last week, about how syncretism of cultures and how when culture really infiltrates Christianity and we don't have any separation, any of what God would call kind of holiness or even purity. I know that word's got a lot of connotations now, but when they're fully blended together, you just see things fall apart significantly. One of the other themes that we talked about was there was no what in the land? King in the land. Remember, it says it 4 times in Judges. There's no king in the land, and all men did as they pleased. Now, what we find out later, when Saul becomes king, is who the king is matters a great deal. And what governs the king, like who the ultimate king is, the capital K king, matters a great deal. Y'all follow me on that so far? So that's general outline stuff. Now I want to get into something a little bit more specific to this period, the cycle of apostasy and deliverance. So this period, we just talked about chapters 3 through 16, there are formulaic elements in the story. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to, as we go along, kind of point out what those elements are that we can identify. So you ready? Here's what some of them are. There's, let me make sure I have the correct notes in front of me. You know what's great is when you print out your pages, but you don't print page numbers on them. That can be a big mistake. So I hope there's no gust of wind, or else I'm in a lot of trouble. All right, so here's what we have. First, in a lot of these stories, we have what's called the negative evaluation formula. This sounds something like, the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, right? That starts it off. Both Othniel and Ehud's narratives had this structure. Next you have what they call the divine committal, which is the Lord gave or the Lord sold the Israelites into the hands of the enemy. Both of these are transactions of ownership, is what they are. They're financial. The words are financial transactions of ownership. They are leaving the Lord's protection, Lord's care, and going into the care of the enemy. Then the stories have the cry of distress, right? We've seen that. Oh, Lord, deliver us. Everything is terrible. We remember you now when we need you because we've been delivered into our enemy. Both of these stories have that. Then we have the divine provision of leadership, right? God raised up. You've heard that phrase so far. Then we have this great reversal and the subjugation of the enemy. You all checking with these elements? These are intentional. I'm going to show you why that's important in a second. Then we have tranquility. The land was at peace. And then we have the death of whoever the ruler was. And guess what the cycle does? Begins again, all right? Which also goes to show you how important leadership is, which is a whole other cultural thread. And so what we're going to do, though, is one of the things that we notice, because after this, we have Gideon, we'll have Jephthah, we'll have Samson. Less and less of these elements are displayed in the narrative. And so remember how I said that how the structure of the book also shows the degradation, the disintegration of Israel. This formula goes like this and becomes less and less and less until it's hardly mentioned at all. And so you have less of this going to the Lord, less of his deliverance, less of the success of what happens next. And so it all kind of continues to fall apart. Does that make sense? So I'm going to actually go ahead and give it to you so we can move on. But when we look, and you can point out those elements, we go from all of these to the story of, and I put, which we'll explain in a second, Deborah, Barak, and Yael. I know it's a J. I'm going to call her Jael because that's easier for me, but that's not how it's pronounced. There's no J pronunciation in Hebrew, which is also why Jehovah, that's not a thing. It's Yahweh. Anyway, that's a whole other kettle of fish, as Father Chris would say. So, what we see in this story, though, is we see only a negative evaluation. Israel did terrible things. Divine committal. Lord delivers them in the hands of their enemies. A cry of distress. And then we have, what's the other one? I have it marked. Then we just go to the land was at rest at the end. So there's only 4 check marks in this formula, and it keeps going less and less. Y'all follow me on that so far? It'll make sense as we continue throughout the book of Judges. So that's all I'm going to harp on that. So now I have a question for you. Why do you think I wrote 3 names here as opposed to 1? They worked together. They wrote the story. Now, what we'll find as we read through this story is there's a big question mark on who this person is. Who's the judge? That's what we would think. The narrator, we're going to go a little bit further into that question, and I'm going to explain that in a second. Because as we said, and as Father Chris mentioned last week, when the book of Judges is talking about judges, is it talking about them in the judicial sense? So if you came across somebody in a story who was defined as a judge in the judicial sense, would that be defining them in the sense of the judges of the book of Judges? No. Just because you are a judge in the book of Judges does not mean you are the judge of the narrative. Does that make sense, everyone? And that's going to matter. So let's go ahead and jump into our narrative. Starting at chapter 4, verse 1. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. Did you all go over the story of Ehud, by the way, last week? Yep. A little bit? Or you read, at least some of you read through it? Great story. It's one of the few examples of Hebrew comedy, by the way. The whole fat enveloping the arm was actually phrased in a way that was supposed to be comedic, which we just kind of say, that's really disgusting, but maybe it was kind of funny. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. So what are some things that you pick up about this initial part? You can't pronounce the names. Yeah, well, fair enough. Yeah, it's never easy. That's why you shouldn't sight read when you get up like I just did. But anyway, a couple other things you notice is, first of all, the big question mark, who's the judge? There's a lot of mystery, actually. This is kind of a mystery story. And who is the battle between? These are the question marks we have, because we don't really find that out. That's only mentioned right here and at the end of the story. A couple other things that we notice here. Sisera is likely, his name is not, he's not a Canaanite by name. He's likely actually a mercenary. He's probably a mercenary specifically in charge of the chariots, like the leader of the cavalry. And so he was likely hired on, because again, we kind of know where names are and where they're associated with, and brought in to kind of champion this cause. And that was not unusual. There was a brief mention of somebody, Shamgar earlier, who's also got a name that's a foreign name. That's a couple chapters ago. So Sisera is likely a Hittite mercenary. And so he's leading this army. And how long did he oppress Israel? 20 years. So was it the case with Israel, as soon as they cry for distress, or things get difficult, are they delivered immediately from their circumstances? Not always, right? 20 years is a long time. And so they were oppressed for a long time. They were oppressed, and it says specifically because of the iron chariots. Now this is the Iron Age. They're moving from the Bronze Age historically to the Iron Age. We know this, that iron makes a big difference as far as weaponry goes. You'll remember that one of the reasons that the Egyptians were so powerful is they had chariots that they used to chase down Moses and his people. People often think of there's some misconception, by the way, about the use of chariots as modern-day tanks that just break through enemy lines. That wasn't their purpose. Their purpose was that they were able to be fast and go around the battlefield and just shoot arrows or stab people from them. And they were also incredibly effective at running down fleeing enemies. That was their main purpose, is if you could get the line to break, you would just mow down everybody. And so because, when you're going into battle, you want to think about an exit strategy. Are you as likely to go to war if you know that if you break or you lose, that's it for you? You're going to be, you're going to be completely routed. And so that was one of the hesitations against going against chariots, and why, again, this was not technology that the Israelites had yet. So a couple other things. No, in fact, let's just continue on. All right, so now Deborah, verse 4. And this is fun. Everybody's name means something. Sometimes you can see what those names mean and they have significance. Deborah, it's a tough one to figure out what it means for the significance of the story, but her name means honeybee. So for trivia night, whenever we have that back at the church, there you go. I'm giving you a question right now. Deborah's name means honeybee. And if you can come up with some way that makes sense to the story throughout the course of our time, I'll give you a cookie. I actually just found these under here. They're Oreos, by the way. I'm not actually using those as incentive. That's Sunday school stuff. All right, so Deborah, honeybee, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, "Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun." I'm going to pause there. A couple things that we notice. Now, right now, who is the obvious candidate for judge to us? Honeybee. Can we just call her Honeybee for the rest of the time, or is that... No. Deborah seems like the obvious choice of a judge, because what action is she taking? She's judging, right? Is she judging in the military commander sense, or is she judging in the judicial sense? Judicial. And this is where this question mark remains, because what the narrator's trying to do is actually keep us on our toes guessing who it might be. First, we think there's Deborah. She's the judge. She's leading Israel by being a prophetess under a tree and making discernments and judgments. Now, there's a couple things about her position. Prophetess has a lineage that goes all the way back to Moses' sister Miriam. In Exodus 15, that was something that she did. The Lord spoke to Miriam, and she spoke the words of the Lord. We know that Miriam was not without fault, just as everybody is not without fault. I think she's the one who gets leprosy at some point for her actions. But so this role of prophetess does have pedigree. Number two, what we learn is that she is sitting there in the role of what Moses used to do. You remember before Moses got help, he would sit there and people would bring cases to him and he would pronounce judgment and discernment over those. And so there's pedigree in that role too. But one thing that you notice very quickly is there's no proper leader of the people to unite the tribes. But because the proper leader of the people there was always a military component of somebody who would go around and gather the tribes of Israel and be able to muster them for battle. That was essential to leadership. That was not just one additional duty. That was essential to leadership. You'll see that with Gideon. You won't see it with Samson because he's his own. Anyway, but that's essentially that's a fun story. But yeah, so that's essential leadership, is the ability to muster troops and have the respect of various tribes of Israel, at least be the leader of your tribe. That wasn't Deborah's role. And so we start to question now, well, is Deborah actually the judge? And so she goes and she sends for Barak. Now his name means lightning. He's got a pretty cool name. If I had looked that up, Asher might have had a different name, my youngest son. But don't tell him that. His name's great and I love it. But Barak's pretty cool. So Barak was summoned by Deborah, and she commands him. She says, has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000, and I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. So again, the narrative is, well, maybe it's Barak now. We have the leader. We found him. The military might. He's going to lead the charge. He's the judge. But is he? Because look at his response. If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. There's lightning for you. That's right. Yeah. Bold, brave, strong. Now, there's a couple ways to interpret. What's your primary reaction to that, by the way? Let me just, what do you think? When he says that, what do you think? What's that? A little louder. He needs her strength. You said mistrust or distrust? Mistrust in whom?
He mistrusts her. He wants to make sure she's going to be there.
Okay, so he thinks, okay, well, maybe she's kind of setting me up because now I'm the guy that's going out there. Ultimately, it's not trusting the Lord because as a prophetess, her job is to speak the words of the Lord. But this isn't a profile of a very commanding presence, isn't it? Would you all kind of agree with that? Now, there are some commentators that make apologies for him in this. And what they say is, well, because she's a prophetess, all he's asking is that the Lord would go with them, which was a common thing. You want the Lord's presence to go before you in battle. You'll remember even all the way back to Moses, the raising up of the arms, and when his arms were raised, there was victory, and when his arms fell down, the Israelites were losing, and so they had Aaron and Miriam hold up his arms. Do you guys is that familiar to you? The effect of somebody who's from the Lord being present, and so they say, well, he's not a coward or a chicken. He just wants God to go with them. That's not what's going on here. He's not stepping into the role that he's supposed to have. He's in fact abdicating his authority. He has been given a position and called to a position by God, and he is shirking it and shrinking away from it. And we know that because of the response that Deborah has for him. Again, verse 8. He said, if you go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. So, is that a positive for him? No. Because glory chasing, I mean, that's something that was incredibly significant. Like, how do you have your name be recognized? It's what you do, right? I mean, anybody watch that movie Troy? Anybody ever read the Iliad, for example? I mean, you see that especially, the masculine pursuit was rooted in glory and achieving glory and a legacy and a name. And to have that stripped from you, or that prophecy stripped from you, is to really just carve out everything about you that is your driving factor and driving force. That pronouncement, I mean, we don't really live in a shame-honor culture anymore. We kind of just, shame is something that we kind of flip things around where we just display shameful things openly, and we're like, see, look at me, and it doesn't matter, and I deserve to be loved, be cared for, and affection. It's like, yes, that's true, but maybe don't air your dirty laundry to everybody, right? I mean, that's kind of what social media has become. Would you all kind of agree with that? And I get it, like, I'm a mess, you're a mess, we're all a mess, that's great. I don't need to hear the particular details about how you're a mess. Unless I'm your priest and I care for you, which I do, just don't do it publicly. All right, so anyway, that's my little soapbox aside. There, shame and honor was the whole, that was it. That was the main focus of the culture. And so, so to have that stripped was a really, really big deal. And now we go back to the question mark again. Okay, well, if Sisera is sold into the hands of a woman, so now the weight of who we think the judge is, because there's supposed to be some mystery here, some question mark. Now it goes back to who? Deborah, right? Okay, well, that's the one. That's the one that God has chosen. All right, let's continue and see if that's the case. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called out Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh. And 10,000 men went up at his heels, and Deborah went up with him. All right, so they're preparing for battle. The Lord's determined the place. The Lord's determined who to call, how to set it up. God's got the battle plan. And so they go up and they take their positions. And then we have this interesting little aside here, which again, good storytelling is, you leave something and then you come, same with comedy, you leave a little something and then you come back to it later, right? You circle back to it. If you ever watch a stand-up bit, people do that, right? They have some kind of part of their act, and at the very end, they tie everything together by going back to it, and we all have a great belly laugh. I've seen like one comedy special. I'm assuming that's how a lot of them go. So that's kind of what we have here, is we have this weird little aside in verse 11, which will become significant. Now Heber the Kenite had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, which, by the way, were traditionally allied with Israelites. Do you notice the connection there? And had pitched his tent as far away as the oak in Zananim, which is near Kadesh. So what do we know? We know, interestingly, that this person, who, again, traditionally would have been allied with the Israelites, has left his tribe and is camped somewhere far away. And you're like, well, what does that mean? Is he going to be an ally? Is he going to be an enemy of theirs? So we have another question mark here. Is he good or bad? Do you see what I mean about it sets up all of these question marks, all of these questions that we have to go through? So we don't know. Verse 12. When Sisera was told that Barak the son of Abinoam had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. And Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you?" So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. Who gets credit? The Lord. Okay, that'll be important. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. Another part of the story of Deborah, we're talking themes, are great reversals. That'll be significant in the Song of Deborah, which we're about to cover. You thought things were going to be this way, and God flipped them completely on their head. Now who's getting pursued? They had the chariots. Now who's getting pursued? and cut down and mow down to a man. Do you see how that's completely flipped it around? This entire pericope is about God flipping the script on what people thought was going to happen. And by the way, you'll see it in the Song of Deborah in a second. How did this happen? Well, they were by a river. The river flooded, which becomes muddy and difficult to move around in. And so how well do chariots do in flooding waters? Not super great, right? And so that's also likely why Sisera got down from his chariot and fled, because you'd think you'd fly, if you got a chariot, why would you get down and run away? Well, he was stuck. And so he just takes off running. All right, so now verse 17. Now, but Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, we'll call her, the wife of Heber the Kenite. And there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. Uh-oh. So now this question's kind of, whose side is he on? Well, there was peace between their houses, right? They were allied. This guy was an outlier who decided to ally with the enemy. And so that's where Sisera goes for help. And Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me. Do not be afraid." So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. What's the imagery here? What's the relational imagery? Can you pick up on it? Who tucks someone in and provides them with milk? A mother, right? A mother, and which would put him in the role of what? Child. This is going to be significant. So we have one big, strong man, military commander that says, "Oh, I'm not going unless you come with me. Can't do it." And then we have another one who runs away and seeks comfort like a child. "Tuck me in, please. Give me something to drink. Oh, here's some warm milk, and rest your head, sweet little boy." It really doesn't speak highly of either of these men, which, again, it goes to, we can read this through our culture as, yay, down with the patriarchy and yay, feminism. But if we do that, what we're doing is we're reading our current cultural lens back into a very different time and context. And when we're reading that into this context, this is very significant. What this is uniformly bad. This is not the fact that people who are supposed to be stepping into roles are abdicating and shirking their responsibilities is not a positive thing. People like to celebrate Deborah or Yael as, this is girl power, this is great, finally we're standing up. That's not the tone of the book of Judges, just so you know. The tone of the book of Judges is people are fleeing from the responsibilities that God has for them. They're not living into the roles that they've been given, and isn't this a shame? And somebody's got to do it, and guess who it falls to? Which is what happens, right? Because a lot of times when men abdicate responsibilities, guess who steps up and fills those roles and is strong in those spaces? And praise God for that, frankly. All right, so he gets all tucked in, all covered up, and he said to her, "Stand at the opening," I'm in verse 20, "of the tent, and if any man comes and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." You know, the construction of that in Hebrew is not "is anyone here," it's "is there a man here?" That's intentional. He tells her, if they say, "Is there a man here?" say no. And you can imagine she's like, "Yeah, of course there's not a man here. I've got a child." And that's intentionally in the text. But Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground while he was lying fast asleep from weariness. So he died. Yeah. There's no, he's not walking away from that one. I mean, if you drive that all the way into the ground, which we're going to talk about Yael in a second, but yeah. The rug? Yeah, And behold, as Barak was pursuing Sisera, why is he pursuing him? What does he want? What does Barak want from Sisera? What will he gain from pursuing him and driving him down? There's a word we mentioned earlier that's of supreme importance to him. Glory. Why would you pursue and take out, why would you go yourself to take out the commander of the opposing army? For glory. He is still grasping after that which was been taken from him and is not his. It's not flattering for him. And behold, as he was pursuing, Yael went out to meet him and said to him, "Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking." By the way, the tone of her language in Hebrew is dismissive. It's not respectful. There's no honorifics. It shows that she thinks just as little of Barak as she thought of Sisera. It's a very condescending tone that she uses. So he went into her tent, and there lay Sisera dead with the tent peg in his temple. Oh, you want him? Here, I've got him for you. Did your job for you. Right? So back to the question mark. Who's the judge? We got another contender. Right? God will deliver him into the hands of a woman. Well, who's that now? We thought it was Deborah. Now we've got somebody else on the scene. And so we have this ambiguity. That's why I wrote 3 names up for the judge from before. All right. So on that day, I'm going to go back to those question marks. Now we're on the far left question marks. You ready? So on that day, God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel, and the hand of the people of Israel pressed harder and harder against Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Jabin, the king of Canaan. Who is the war between? Who's fighting the battle? Who's it between? We thought Sisera, Barak, Deborah. Who is it? It's God. And that's what we learn. And again, like always in Scripture, God does not use, beating a straight line with a crooked stick? Is that the phrase? God always chooses heroes in Scripture who are less than heroic, who have flaws. And one of the reasons he does that is so our attention and affection and appreciation and everything would be directed toward God. So that God would get the glory primarily and not us. Now we know in the New Testament that God, by His great grace and mercy, we are glorified in Him. So we, as we draw close to Him, are able to, He allows us to share in His glory, which is unreal, but it's all about God. That's what the whole book of Judges is about. We talk about there's no king in the land. The king ultimately is the Lord. And they've forgotten that. All right, we've got very little time. And so we're going to go into the song of Deborah and Barak. So this is going to be, again, Judges chapter 5. This kind of fleshes out a little bit of the story. A lot of times you'll read, not a lot of times, several times in Scripture, you'll read a narrative account and a poetic account. That happens in Genesis, by the way, with the account of creation. You have a more narrative structure and a poetic structure. And you say, well, it just repeats itself. People are just, slamming different sources together. It's like, no, that's intentional. That was a way of speaking. And so, all right, I'm going to get to my notes, and then we're going to jump in. Oh, by the way, is anybody curious what Yael means? We're just doing name meanings now. Also, if you can find significance for this, I'll give you $20, $10. I got to be reasonable. It's mountain goat. So again, if you can find some sort of meaning from mountain goat, like is it the milk, the mountain goat? I don't know, but that's her name. Which again, like what kind of parent names their daughter mountain goat? That is not kind. All right, so Judges 5. This is the theme. This is the theme of Judges 5. It is all about the Lord and the Lord's power and the Lord's ability to dominate the enemies of the Israelites. And some cool things we know about it. When we look at different texts, we can see based on the type of Hebrew how old or like when in history it was written. The Song of Deborah is one of the absolute oldest texts it uses the absolute oldest Hebrew. That, and I think Job, and then there was a third one that are all kind of tied for the oldest sections of Scripture. And there is no reason to believe that Deborah didn't write it herself. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that Deborah wrote it herself. One, it says, then sang Deborah and Barak. That's a good indication. Number two, there's some maternal themes in this song that Deborah would stereotypically likely to pick up more than a guy writing a song. And you'll see those in a second too. And there's a lot of reversals in this. So you all ready? All right. Then sang Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, on that day, that the leaders took the lead in Israel, that the people offered themselves willingly, bless the Lord. Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes, to the Lord I will sing. I will make melody to the Lord, the God of Israel. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched out from the region of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens dropped. Yes, the clouds dropped water. The mountains quaked before the Lord, even Sinai before the Lord, the God of Israel. Divine themes before we keep going. God is marching out from the south in this song. From Mount Sinai, from Seir, God is marching out. The Canaanites are located where? The north. There's a subtext here of the clashing of deities, a subtext of God marching out against the deities of the Canaanites, marching up from the south to conquer. Verse 6, in the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, and the days of Yael, the highways were abandoned. The travelers kept to the byways. The villagers ceased in Israel. They ceased to be until I arose. Deborah arose as a mother in Israel. See the theme? There's a strong maternal theme in this. Another thing, here's some easy questions. Why would the highways be abandoned? It's dangerous, right? We know that the Israelites at this time, they did not live in walled cities. They lived up on hills and villages. And the hills were their protection. That was their defense. Whereas Canaanites lived more in the plains and the valleys, and they had walled cities. And the Israelites didn't go down into the valleys. They didn't travel around because it was dangerous. When new gods were chosen, what is that? That's their syncretism, right? That's them starting to take up the Canaanite gods, the local gods, and incorporate them into their faith. Then war was in the gates. Metaphor. What's war in the gates mean? Brought to your doorstep. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel? Again, we know that they weren't the first takers of workers of iron, right? They didn't have the same level of weaponry that their surrounding neighbors had. My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves willingly among the people, bless the Lord. Tell of it, you who ride on white donkeys, you who sit on rich carpets, you who walk by the way. To the sound of musicians at the watering places, there they repeat the righteous triumphs of the Lord, the righteous triumphs of his villagers in Israel. Then down to the gates marched the people of the Lord. Awake, awake, Deborah. Awake, awake, break out in song. Arise, Barak, lead away your captives, O son of Abinoam. Then down marched the remnant of the noble. The people of the Lord marched down for me against the mighty. From Ephraim, their root, they marched down into the valley, following you, Benjamin, with your kinsmen. I'm going to pause for a second. We're about to list some of the tribes of Israel that participated and some of those that did not. Do you remember how many tribes of Israel there are? 12. Not all of them participated, to their shame, as we'll hear about. 2 aren't even mentioned at all, which people think of as an anti-Judahite bin, because the tribe of Judah was not one of them. But here we go. Following you, Benjamin, with your kinsmen, from Machir, which is another term for Manasseh, marched down the commanders, and from Zebulun those who bear the lieutenant's staff. The princes of Issachar came with Deborah, and Issachar faithful to Barak. Into the valley they rushed at his heels. Among the clans of Reuben there were great searchings of heart. Why did you sit still among the sheepfolds to hear the whistling for the flocks? Among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and Dan, why did he stay with the ships? Asher sat still at the coast of the sea, staying by his landings. Zebulun is a people who risk their lives to the death. Naphtali too on the heights of the field. The kings came, they fought. Then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh, by the waters of Megiddo. They got no spoils of silver. From heaven the stars fought, and their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent Kishon swept them away, the ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon. March on, my soul, with might. The loud beat of the horse's hooves with the galloping of his steeds. Couple things. We talk about the dissolution, the breaking up, the degradation, throw a D word in there of what's happening to Israel. The tribes aren't even banding together. They're not coming together and acknowledging Israelites as their brothers, right? They're saying, you know what, that's beyond the Jordan. That's your problem. It's not my problem. It hasn't hit my gates yet. Which is pretty common human nature, right? I forgot the percentage. They did a study on this, which I found fascinating. The percentage of those who would actually stand up and support someone that they identified with, kinsmen, somebody of the same ideological or religious position, when they were, when there was an attack, like what the percentage of people that stood up was, I know it was less than 10%, significantly less than 10% of people who were actually willing to take a stand and not just look around and see everything crumble. And that's absolutely human nature, and we see that coming out here. And then this is just an interesting little translation part. The galloping of the steeds is better translated, the desperate pawing of the horse's hooves. So they're all falling and floundering, and they're just scrambling around. This isn't their power and might. This is, look, the chariots are all going underwater. Verse 23. Curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord. Curse its inhabitants thoroughly, because they did not come to the help of the Lord against the mighty. Most blessed of women, Beiel, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a noble's bowl. She sent her hand to the tent peg, and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. We're going to stop at verse 27. Between her feet he sank. He fell, he lay still. Between her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell, dead. Between her feet is a euphemism. It just is. I'm not going to be explicit. You all are adults and you have imaginations. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And what is being described here as the tent peg and the mallet are being, described as between her being launched between her feet and driving him into the ground. This is quite frankly, it's a reverse case of rape, is what it is. This is couched in the terms of rape. This is, and we find out, what was an ancient practice. Once the men went in and conquered a region, what happened to the women? They were raped them. That was very common. I mean, like anything else would be an exception to the rule. And so what we talk about this, remember I talked about how this is a story of reversals, and we're about to see what Sisera would have done had he won in the end of this song. But this is a story of reversals. It's a story of, and again, obviously rape is wrong in any context, but what it is it's a story of the world upside down. It's a story of everything flipped upside down. And so let's continue on. Out of the window, now we're being brought to a different scene. Scene change. Out of the window she peered. The mother of Sisera wailed through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? So now we go back to the scene of a mother, right? We have Deborah, the mother of Israel. Yael, who takes the role of a mother. Now we have Sisera's own mother. So it's like, well, I guess we have compassion for her because she's waiting for her son to come home, and he's never going to come home. He's waiting for him to return, and he'll never be back. But our compassion is very short-lived, and here's why. Let's go on to verse 29. Her wisest princesses answer. Indeed, she answers herself. Have they not found and divided the spoil? A womb or two for every man. Spoil of dyed materials for Sisera. Spoil of dyed materials embroidered. 2 pieces of dyed work embroidered for the neck as spoil. So may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but your friends be like the sun as he rises in his might. And the land had rest for 40 years. What are they saying back in verse 30? Have they not found and divided the spoil, a womb or two for every man? What are they saying? Yeah, are they not just describing, reducing the stature of a woman to her parts, to a womb, is about as degrading as you can get. Reducing a woman to what is her unique biological function is incredibly degrading in Hebrew. By the way, here's my brief political stint, incredibly degrading today to reduce woman to a bleeder or a menstruator or a birthing person, which are all terms that have been used because some people can't figure out what a woman is anymore, and so they have to have something to use to delineate the different genders. So let's just degrade women by reducing her to her parts. That seems like a good way to go. But that's what they're doing here. They're reducing a woman to her parts.
But this is his mother saying this.
This is his mother saying this about other women.
That's what's so dastardly about it.
Yeah.
It's a woman talking about other women.
In that way. Do you see how my compassion for her was short-lived? Lasted the length of a verse? Yeah, we'll be all right. Yes, Jim.
And there was no silver. They probably would have preferred silver, but they're going to use the women because that's all there was, correct?
Yeah, they'll do it all. Whatever's in front of them, they'll take. And again, verse 31 declares once more, who's this about? It's about the Lord and the fact that it was the Lord's armies. He's the holy warrior. He's the one that goes out and marches against these people. So now that we've kind of gone through the text with our few remaining minutes, are there any other themes or anything that you want to touch on or anything that comes up to you in the story of Deborah? Any thoughts or any parallels to today? This is... What do you all think? Betrayal. Yeah. Sure. Here's another one. I'm going to step into it. Here we go. But I'm not really stepping into it.
I'd like to see if you do it, so let's see what you got.
Since, what was his name? Archie Bunker? Yeah. All the way to shows like Modern Family, to The Simpsons, to who's the sap? The husband. The man's the sap. Like who can you make fun of without raising anybody's concerns? It's the man. That's the case. And if you look at the book of Judges, what we see here is that's a disordered society. That's not the way that things are supposed to be. And again, Ecclesiastes, we know that there's nothing new under the sun. We just have another cyclical pattern of that. But let's, if we're really going to kind of shake things up, let's reverse the way that things have been for a very long time. Now we're saying, what about women's rights? I'm not going there. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the degradation and the abdication of the responsibility and the role of man, and what that turns to in society, and how that flips things on their head. And you have, there's also, as we know, kind of an epidemic of, and by the way, we see this in the church too, right? What would happen on Mother's Day? You ever go to a church, and we don't do that here, where on Father's Day, you bash on the man for his lacking of responsibility and stepping up? Has anybody ever heard that? I've heard it. You bash on the guy, and then on Mother's Day, you celebrate the mother, right? That's safe. You've never heard it? Oh, good. Well, you must have been at Trinity for a long time, because we aren't going to do that here. That's considered safe in a lot of places. Now imagine that was reversed, right? On Mother's Day, we're like, here are the failures of moms. That'd be it for us. I'd be like, well, Father, it's been good. Yeah, been a good run. I'm tent pegs, right? Everybody just exact, yeah, and fair enough. So you see that reversal, and you also see again. This is me ranting and whatever. I'm old enough now. I can do that. Although I'm technically a millennial, so you don't have to let me forget that. You see a lot of man boys. That's also something that's pretty evident here that we see, right? Like if you're 30 years old, it's not unusual for it to be in your mother's basement playing Xbox and eating Cheetos while you figure out what you want to do with your life. And so that's another part of this text that brings out is you have this retreat, this shrinking down, this somebody hold my hand and tuck me in. That is a sign of cultural decay, universally a sign of cultural decay.
Yeah, not just here, historically, it's the Romans, the Greeks, you name it.
Yeah. Anytime people become hedonistic and retreat from things that are difficult, which is what this is. It's a retreat from things that are difficult and hard living. Then you have things start to fall apart. Yes, Jim.
I think the other thing I've noticed is that about 80% or 90% of ads on television picture the man as a complete idiot. This guy, he has no courage, no thoughts. He's just a weenie.
Yes. Yeah, we see it. Yeah, we see it in advertisements.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah.
And the irony, though, is I'm thinking through this, what you just pointed out about the woman who was kind of degrading Cicero, what was her name?
Yael.
Yeah. Not only when a man doesn't fulfill his responsibility and backs away from it, the women resent that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, well, I mean, look at the way that she talks about Barak. She's like, I cleaned up your mess. And she also shows contempt for her husband. By the way, like, we don't even hear about this guy. This guy's, she feels comfortable enough to throw off the conventions of hospitality, comfortable enough to make her own assertions and welcoming in Sisera without any consultation or even discussion with your spouse, and killing him, which kind of puts her husband in an awkward position because that was his ally. So it's like, well, guess we're moving back home, honey, And so, like Yael, she, in her language towards all these guys, she shows just utter contempt is the word. Which, by the way, done research on this too. We talk about women's resentment. Here's a little bonus for marriage counseling is they've done studies on what the Gottman has them the 4 horsemen of divorce. So what are the predictors of when a relationship falls apart? I'm going to see how many I can remember off the top of my head now that I put myself on the spot without looking at it. Defensiveness, stonewalling, contempt, and there's a 4th one that'll come to me as I continue to talk, as things typically go. You can look it up. But the number 1 predictor of all those 4 horsemen, there's a 4th one. We'll pretend we're going to edit it in later, so I look like I know what I'm talking about. The biggest predictor of divorce of all those 4 horsemen is contempt. They say once you reach the level of contempt, it's not impossible. It is very difficult to turn that ship around when there's regular contempt. And what's that? Yeah, it's very hard. Now, again, thank goodness. By the way, I'm not thank goodness, people can come back from serious things, but that's important to notice in this story too. All right. Any other thoughts on this text as we go to wrap up? Criticism, which I remembered and did not just Google. Criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Just gonna put this away. That's why you stick to your notes. All right. So do you have any other thoughts about this text or anything that it contributes to the general theme of the book of Judges? One last piece of trivia. This story is told in Hebrews, recounted in the Hall of Faith as one of the periods of which God entered in and intervened with his people. And we're going to find out in Hebrews which of the names was picked of those three. So who gets the credit? So if you want to try to beat me there, turn to Hebrews 11. This is just an extra little fun thing that helps us answer the question of who's the judge. All right, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32. Page 1008, if you are using this Bible. If you're curious about where it is, this is about how far into the New Testament it is. There you go. Because I notice a lot of us have different Bibles, and if they're study Bibles, that's awesome and good for you. Yep. All right. It says, "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets." So who ultimately is the judge? I know. We're all like, seriously, that guy? But again, it's not that he gets the glory of it. But that was the role that God had intended for him, and it would have been he would have been remembered much differently had that not changed. And so, there's this great quote from C.S. Lewis that I'm also going to butcher because it's not in my notes, but it's for God will surely use you whatever you do, but it makes a difference to you. Whether he uses you like a Judas or a John. And I think that that's really interesting. When you think about it, like we're all part of this divine story that God is weaving. I mean, that's a big part of the book of Judges, that things are in God's hands. He's controlling the outcome. He's the one that's weaving these things together. And we're all participants in that. How we show up and how we participate has a lot to do with our response to God and how he uses us in those moments. And so that's one of the lessons that we take from this. Another lesson that we take from this, and the fact that a bunch of tribes didn't show up and Barak tried to throw away the glory, is following God is not a spectator sport. It requires participation and involvement and engagement. And the sum of your story will be very different based on how much you lean into the Lord. Now, does that mean you go off and do great things and pray the Lord comes behind you and blesses what you've chosen to do? That's not what I'm talking about. All I'm talking about is regular, faithful engagement to the Lord and letting him use that engagement in whatever direction he decides to. Does that make sense? And it could be now, it could be 20 years from now. But it's not, I'm going to build my life this way and hope the Lord blesses that. It's, Lord, give me the direction, let me lean into you. I'm going to take steps because I think this is what I have from you, and sometimes all we get is that next step. That's all we know is the next step that we're supposed to take, and God will says, I'll reveal the rest to you later. You just do what I ask you to do. But the Lord can use all of us in some very significant and amazing ways, even when it doesn't look like we have anything to work with. So again, Christianity is not a spectator sport. God calls us to participate in what he's calling us to do. Do you all have any other takeaways before we close? Yes.
Well, didn't Deborah say to Barak in the beginning, didn't the Lord call you? Didn't the Lord command you? So if that's really the case, then Barak, it makes sense.
Yeah, didn't the Lord call you? Yeah, didn't the Lord call you? Didn't the Lord command you, Barak? Yes, it's his job.
Yeah.
It was his job. So, all right, let's close. Heavenly Father, we thank you once again for revealing your text to us, for showing us how your hand is at work and that you are the one who sets the stage, but also the one who authors our stories and the grand narrative that you've called us to participate in. God, I pray that we would heed your call, that we would step up when you have called us into positions of God, leadership, service, and whatever you'd put before us. And God, I thank you for the fact that we can trust in the ending, know that you have it all written in advance, and that you're in control. In your Son, Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.